People, we are dealing with one of the most significant weather events I've seen in a long time. It's been just over 30 years since I've gotten my forecaster certifications in the Air Force, and I've studied a lot of these historical events, these Arctic outbreaks of years gone by, and I've never quite seen what we're looking at right now in terms of the different ways that this system will break records. I'll get into these specifics shortly, but let's spend a few minutes going over what we have right now, including up in the Arctic. Okay, I'll get my face out of the way there, and you can see what's going on around the country. The tip of the iceberg, that's showing up in the Dakotas. This afternoon, we've got air temperatures down to minus 18, minus 17. Those are thermometer temperatures. Those are not wind chills. I'm not going to give you wind chills unless I'm telling you that specifically. So we do know that this is some really cold air. The zero line coming through Minnesota, just west of the Twin Cities, down into the Pierre area, south of Rapid City, and over into Montana. You can see that much of Montana is below zero, and parts of it are approaching minus 20. The freezing line moving through Chicago this hour already moved through Oklahoma City and has moved through Childress, not quite through Amarillo. So the westward push of that cold air, not really all that strong at this hour. Now we do have another front down there in the Gulf. There it is. You can see some very juicy conditions, warm, 72 over 65. That's supporting some squall line thunderstorms west of the Keys. And this is our southernmost frontal boundary, extending all the way down into Mexico, and then the actual Arctic outbreak, that's it coming down through the plains. Out west, it is still fairly cold at this hour, 31 at Tonopah, 46 at Vegas, so the air is a little bit chilled in this area, but more of it will be trying to spill over the Continental Divide. Not much progress just yet, but we should see some changes over the days ahead. Then we move up towards the Arctic and take a look at what's going on in that area. Yeah, minus 40 in British Columbia. That's going to be Prince George, I believe. Minus 44 up at Fort Nelson. And you can see it just gets worse as you go north. Temperatures approaching minus 60 Fahrenheit. Again, that's not wind chill. That's going to be right there in Yukon. There's the current webcam at Faro. This is live as we record this, and the air temperature there, minus 49. So that is some frigid air. And also plenty of cold up in Alaska, minus 45 in the interior. Fairbanks around minus 15 to minus 20, but up there at Fort Yukon, minus 51. And as we head into central Canada, plenty of minus 20s and minus 30s, so we are dealing with a very cold air mass. And in the Canadian prairies, widespread minus 20s to minus 30s. And this is a bulky air mass with considerable volume, and it extends all the way down into Manitoba. You can see the thickness lines carrying that all the way into the Dakotas, and a big chunk of it back into southeastern Alaska. So this is very large in terms of spatial extent. Not much going on in eastern Canada, a little Maritimes system off the coast there. Temperature's pretty mild there, and then we circle back to the U.S. And now we go into the forecast. We're looking at the GFS dynamical model as shown on AWIPS, and that's the same tool that Weather Service forecasters use. We try to use as much of the genuine stuff that the Weather Service forecasters use, and that's the stuff I prefer as well. So you're seeing what the actual official forecasters are looking at. So let me go and get myself out of the way so I can focus on the actual data instead of on the video. So going forward into tonight, what we see here is the Arctic air reflected by the very low thickness values. That's those red lines. That's showing very low values. For example, 2550 in Yukon. That's measuring the geopotential height difference between 1,000 and 700 millibars, which is basically corresponding to the density or the temperature of the air. In other words, through the lowest 2 or 3 kilometers, the air is very, very cold. So that's kind of what it's telling us there. It's better than taking a temperature sample at the surface and just looking at that. This is more meaningful, and this shows more of the volume of the cold air. And around that, this shows kind of a large bubble of cold air. That's kind of the edge right there, and that is the cold air across Western Canada and adjoining areas. And with that, high pressure, which is being caused by a combination of strong subsidence along with the very dense low levels of the atmosphere. So if we run that forward, you can see that the pressures come up quite a bit. In fact, by Thursday morning, 1066 millibars in Montana. That has never been observed. The record is 1064 millibars. I think that was in Cutbank, Montana in December of '83. Now, I don't know whether we're going to actually see 1066 millibars because there are some pressure reduction problems, and there's no good way of doing that. The ECMWF has 1060 millibars, so we don't know for sure whether we're going to actually break that record, but it does look like it's going to be pretty close. And with that, the cold air comes flooding into the plains. Some very impressive numbers here on the dynamical model ensembles. This is a graph here of the recurrence intervals, and if any of you have worked in insurance or engineering, you know that a 30-year recurrence interval means a very rare event. And this is shaping up to be unusual in terms of heights, in terms of temperature, wind speed, sea level pressure, and so on. Now for the Great Plains, wind speed will be an issue. Some very strong winds coming back behind that system, and then by evening, the 1,000 millibar recurrence interval, looking at about 30 years there in East Texas. So there could be the potential for some very strong winds. And there's a closer look at that. That's going to be a 30-year recurrence interval over East Texas. I don't know if that's actually going to be realized, because in these very unusual, strong events, that's when the models tend to have failures. So we're just going to have to wait and see what the newer models run go for as far as winds. So going through the rest of the picture, I'm going to show you another interesting development. Take a look out here along the leading edge of the front. This is going to be on Thursday during the day. And we see low pressure developing out there in the Great Lakes. So we're looking at this area right here, and some very dramatic pressure falls all the way down to possibly 958 millibars. And that's going to be about 30 millibars in 24 hours, which is what you need for a meteorological bomb. That only requires a 24 millibar drop in 24 hours. And that tends to be rare over the land. Usually when we see that, that's interaction with the Gulf Stream waters. And Pivotal Weather has a very nice plot of that. So there's our low heading out towards Indiana later during the day on Thursday. And during this 24-hour window right here, this is where we see that dramatic deepening over Michigan. And I should mention some very strong pressure gradients in the wake of that. So that's going to spell very strong winds in Indiana and Ohio. It's going to almost be blizzard conditions. Maybe not quite, but very close. And towards Friday, later during the day, that's where we see those dramatic pressure falls. 957 near Barrie, Ontario. So the all-time record for that is 955 millibars, I believe, which was in October 2010 in Minnesota. And that is a little bit outside the U.S., but, you know, there's a good margin for error there. It's pretty impressive. We could be looking at record high pressure, all-time highs, and all-time lows. Now, in Canada, that's a different story. The lowest pressure there was 940 millibars in Newfoundland. That was with the great January 1977 storm. We're probably not going to see 940 with this, but nevertheless, this is a very impressive storm system. It's been a long time since I've seen anything like this from start to finish. Okay, let's look at what we have going on with winds. I'm going to work our way up the front, starting with Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, these are going to be sustained winds. The gusts are probably going to be about maybe 30 to 50% higher. So we're looking at about 25 knots across much of Texas and Oklahoma, so gusts up to 40 miles an hour very likely. And let's see if we can find those strong winds in East Texas. Don't quite see them, so a little bit of a discrepancy with the models. I'm seeing about maybe 20 knots in East Texas, so that's one thing that suggests maybe we're not going to be steamrolled by a big windstorm. But behind it, some very cold temperatures, and let me just give you some of the representative readings. Early on Friday, you can see Dallas around 16, which is pretty realistic since there's not much snow cover. 7 degrees in Oklahoma City, 5 in Amarillo, and in Austin about 21. So let's take a look up the boundary. And I'm probably going to save some of this for tomorrow's stream. And that's when we're going to take a look at the big Great Lakes system. So we're going to focus mostly on the cold here. And it looks like lots of 20-knot winds across the Midwest. Don't quite see any 30s in there. Yeah, there's a little 30-knot wind up there around Milwaukee. So that's going to be during the day on Friday. And that's in the wake of that developing system there in the Great Lakes. And this dark shading right here, that is the 0 Fahrenheit line for air temperatures. I did want to take that back just a few hours, back to about 6 a.m., and look at the extent of these sub-zero temperatures all the way down to Kentucky, all the way down to Missouri. And there's some values, 0 at St. Louis, about 1 degree at Chicago. So it's not terribly bad, but it is awful with those wind chills. And Minneapolis, -7. Paducah, about -1. And there's the rest of that field, the 0 line coming all the way down towards Chattanooga. And Atlanta, they're looking at about 17 degrees. And you can see the extent of those strong winds, and I want to emphasize, if you keep pets outdoors and you're east of the Rockies, especially in the plains, the Midwest, or the Northeast, make sure you arrange to get them inside by Wednesday night or Thursday morning. Or at the very least, make sure they have a good sturdy shelter that's not facing in a north direction. Make sure you get that word out to anybody you know. I've been in the profession for 33 years, and this is going to be a very bad wind chill event. All right, you remember this graphic. We're going to take a look at those temperatures and watch the cold air flow southward. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to run this forward through 240 hours. Don't worry about freeze framing it. I'm going to go back through this in more detail, but there you go. You're going to see the march of the cold temperatures coming south. The date and time are at the bottom right. And there's that cold air on its way through much of the country, the worst of it up in North Dakota and Minnesota. So let's go back to the beginning. And the first frame does not have the pressure and winds, but the following frames do. And there's the initial polar air that we have right now, later today. And then we go back through the rest of the sequence. The very cold air lurking up to the north. You can see the -20s in Great Falls and Billings. And there's a little pocket of -40 right there, those little pink shades right there. That's going to be early tomorrow morning. Now, typically when we have cold air spilling into these mountainous areas, that can set the state all-time temperature records in those areas, so I would not be surprised to see some records with this event. Those do tend to be localized. You don't really need a large record-breaking event through the rest of the country to get those kinds of readings. You just need a vast volume of that cold air going over the Continental Divide. So let's go through the rest of the sequence. Going into Friday, we start out with the coldest temperatures Friday morning. You can see that 0 line all the way down into Kentucky, Missouri, down to Wichita, as I mentioned. And then up there in the Dakotas, looks like -25, maybe around Minot. And then through the rest of the day, we're going to have a rather potent nor'easter storm, well inland though, in the northeastern U.S. Mount Washington probably getting some tremendous winds. And then for Saturday morning, another cold morning, especially up north, some recovery, modification of that air mass down south, but the zero line remaining up there around Topeka, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. And then we'll see a warm-up after that, some rapid modification, and the fact we don't have much snow cover will help with that. The strong southerly winds, the downslope, you can see those 50s coming into Amarillo by Sunday. And the northeastern U.S., that deserves mention as well. Nothing initially when we start the sequence, but towards Thursday and Friday, there we go, some mixed precipitation starting to enter the area. Warm air advection setting in, changes over to liquid forms, and then we get that massive system coming in from the west. And some thunderstorms certainly possible within that. Overall, very showery, and we get a transition over back towards mixed precip and eventually snow, but some very tight gradients in this area here. There you go. You can see sustained winds 25 to 30 knots, quite widespread. Looks a little bit higher up around Montreal. I think I lost that frame. Yeah, right in there. You see around Montreal, some 35 knots winds showing, Burlington, down towards Vermont. And let's take a look at those peak wind gusts. wxcharts.com, a great site for that. So Wednesday, not much going on, but by Thursday, things start picking up dynamically in upstate New York, start to get some gusts up to about 40 miles an hour, and it gets worse. And look at those purple showing up. Some widespread gusts up to 50 to 60 miles an hour. Could see a lot of limbs down with those kinds of winds, and you can see offshore from Boston, even some 70 to 80 mile an hour winds. So looking at this depiction of the pressure field, not seeing that 957 millibar low, looks like maybe 960 to 961. And there's the pivotal weather plot. And yeah, they don't have it labeled there, but looks like 959 millibars for Friday night. So it's going to be right up in this region right here. So it looks like it's shifted maybe a tiny bit north and weakened just a tiny bit. And I almost forgot a very rare extratropical frontal passage through Hawaii. The cold front located about right there. Yesterday, this is yesterday about 4 p.m. Central. Not sure what that is in Hawaii, probably about noon. But Barking Sands, they had gusts even higher than this earlier. They were up to about 35 knots out of the northwest. And temperatures struggling to get into the 70s. And as we roll this forward through yesterday afternoon, you can kind of make out that front moving southeastward down the island chain. I think at this point is probably about right there. You can see 63 on this island. I forgot which one that is. And those northwesterly winds take over. And temperatures stay mostly in the 60s and low 70s. So quite an interesting event. And let's take a look at the visible imagery for Hawaii. You can see starting out yesterday morning, this area of cloudiness, that's going to be the frontal boundary with some showers and storms along that. As we go through the day yesterday, they shift southeastward down the islands. By dusk, the front moving towards the Big Island, and Honolulu located about right there, mostly in the clear air, but still residual moisture, helping to get cells going. And then after dark, a few more of those cells pop up. Very unusual for that part of the country. And just a quick look at the checkerboard of watches and warnings, a lot of them all the way down from Canada to the Gulf Coast. Most of these are going to be wind chill advisories. A few winter storm watches posted here and there, winter storm warnings, and we'll take a look at this in more detail for tomorrow. We're still a couple days away from this event. Okay, let's take a look at those temperature records for tomorrow. Yeah, this is going to be the calm before the storm. Most of the country starting out near seasonal normals. And what a change for Thursday. Look at that. Great Falls, Montana, minus 39 being forecast. minus 28 for Billings, minus 32 for Kalispell. Yeah, I had to make sure that was not an error. Look at that. This is the breakdown of the official Weather Service forecast. Minus 38 being forecast for tomorrow night, with wind chill values down to minus 50. A quick check of the climatology for Great Falls. Minus 43 is the coldest they've seen it in December, and minus 44 the coldest ever. So we're not going to be breaking those records, but possibly, yeah, almost definitely, this is going to break the record for the date. And Seattle dropping down to 15, but that is not going to break a record. For Friday, numerous records in the high plains, minus 23 at Billings, minus 16 at Goodland, and minus 3 at Borger, Texas. And on Saturday, most of the country near seasonal normals, maybe a little bit on the cold side, but this shows you that the amount and the degree of record-breaking cold is not going to be that extensive. This is mostly going to be a system measured in extreme wind chills down to minus 50 through the northern states, and of course the very deep low in the Great Lakes, the very strong high in Montana, and the development of a strong weather system in the northeastern U.S. There's how it looks on Sunday, Christmas. Moderation of that Arctic blast, but still some residual cold weather in the Missouri River Valley. And then going into Monday, warm temperatures return in the desert southwest. So really, the only thing that has stopped this from becoming a superstorm in terms of temperatures has been the absence of snow cover across much of the Midwest and Central Plains. If we had that, yeah, we will probably see a whole lot of records falling through much of the country. And that will do it for this edition of Forecast Lab. I need to get this posted and out the door. Thank you very much to our new Patreon supporters, Jake Radermacher and Matthew Janot. Thank you very much for your support. It does mean a lot. We'll be back tomorrow for another edition of Forecast Lab. Please subscribe and like and comment. That will be much appreciated. Take care, and we'll see you very shortly. Bye-bye.